I remember the exact moment I realized my own son wanted me dead. It was 2 in the morning. I was lying on a thin folding cot inside a cold, unheated garage in the back of the house I had helped Christopher buy. My fingers were so stiff I could barely feel them. The concrete floor underneath me breathed out cold air like a freezer. Above me, a bare bulb hung from the ceiling, and one of the garage windows had a crack in it that let the Pennsylvania night wind slice right through. I had asked Christopher to fix it 3 times. He never did. I pulled the thin blanket tighter around my shoulders and closed my eyes, trying to sleep. That is when I heard them, the voices, coming through the thin wall that separated the garage from the kitchen. My son Christopher Valentine and his wife, Sherry Perkins. They were talking low, but the crack in the wall near the electrical outlet carried every word straight to me like a telephone wire. I heard Sherry say something about the house. Then Christopher laughed. Not a warm laugh. Not the laugh I remembered from when he was a little boy running to me after school. This laugh was cold and careful, like a door clicking shut. And then I heard the word that made my heart stop dead in my chest. He said my name, he said Judith. And what followed after that changed everything I thought I knew. I reached slowly for the slim smartwatch on my wrist. My granddaughter Lynn had given it to me just weeks before. My hand was shaking, my chest was tight. But my mind, the same mind that had spent 31 years inside the courtrooms of Pennsylvania, was already wide awake and working. I pressed the small button on the side of the watch and held my breath. And what I heard next changed everything. But let me take you back to where this story truly began. My name is Judith Elliott. I am 68 years old. For 31 years, I worked as a court clerk in the county courthouse right here in Pennsylvania. I have watched judges sentence criminals. I have filed restraining orders, emergency injunctions, and guardianship papers. I have seen more legal documents than most lawyers ever touch in a lifetime. I know the law the way some people know the Bible. I know its power, and I know what happens when someone tries to twist it for the wrong reasons. I raised Christopher Valentine on my own after his father passed. He was 9 years old when we lost Robert, and I worked double shifts at the courthouse just to keep our little house on Maple Grove Lane warm and the lights on. I gave Christopher everything I had, every school trip, every baseball uniform, every dollar I could spare. He was my whole world. And for a long time, I truly believed I was his. Christopher grew up, went to college, got a steady job in logistics, and married a woman named Sherry Perkins. Sherry was polite when she needed to be, and quiet when she was not. She had sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, and she always seemed to be calculating something behind her smile. But Christopher loved her. So, because I loved Christopher, I tried my best to love Sherry too. They had a daughter together named Lynn Burks, from Sherry's first marriage. But Christopher had adopted her, and she called me Grandma Judy from the time she could barely talk. That little girl had more heart in her pinky finger than her mother had in her whole body. She called me every single Sunday, no matter what. She is the reason I am still alive today, though she does not fully know that yet. Now, I had a mild stroke on a Thursday afternoon in October. I was sitting at my kitchen table going through some old paperwork when the left side of my face went numb, and my coffee cup slipped out of my hand and shattered on the floor. I called for help right away. My neighbor Joan Brock was outside raking leaves and heard me through the open window. She called 911 and stayed with me until the ambulance came, holding my hand the whole time. Joan saved my life that day, though she would be far too modest to ever say so herself. After 3 days in the hospital, the doctors said the stroke was mild. My speech was clear. My mind was sharp. But they wanted me to rest and not be alone for a while. They said I needed supervised care for at least a few weeks while I recovered. I did not have a long-term care plan drawn up. I had always been healthy. I never thought I would need one so soon. That is when Christopher called. He called the hospital room directly. He said, "Mom, Sherry and I talked it over. We want you to come stay with us. We have the space. You should not be alone right now." His voice sounded warm and certain, the way it used to sound when he was young, and everything felt simple between us. I cried a little right there in that hospital bed. I told him I was proud of him for stepping up like this. I told him I loved him, He said he loved me too. I should have listened more carefully to what he did not say. I signed myself out of the hospital on a Saturday morning. My former colleague from the courthouse, Craig Barksdale, drove me to Christopher's house. Craig was a quiet and steady man who had worked as a court administrator for more than 20 years, and he knew me better than most people in this world. He helped me carry my 2 bags to the front door and waited until Christopher answered. Christopher shook Craig's hand and smiled wide and said everything was going to be just fine. Craig looked at me for a moment, longer than felt normal. Then he said quietly, "You call me Judith. Anytime, day or night." I smiled and told him not to worry. I should have listened to Craig. The first sign came before I even set my bags down. Sherry met me in the hallway with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She said very quickly that the guest bedroom had a burst pipe and that repairs were still being worked on. She said it fast and kept walking, as if she did not want me to ask any questions. Christopher led me through the kitchen to a door at the back of the house. He opened it and led me into the garage. There was a folding cot set up against the far wall. Next to it sat a small lamp resting on top of an upside-down cardboard box. There was one blanket, thin and worn almost through. The concrete floor was bare. One of the garage windows had a crack sealed with a strip of old masking tape that had already started to curl away from the glass. The garage smelled like motor oil and cold air. I stood there and looked at it all for a long moment. Then I turned to Christopher and said, "Is this temporary?" He nodded quickly, still not meeting my eyes. He said, "Just for a little while, Mom. You'll be fine in the garage for a while. We'll get the room fixed up real soon." He said it the way you say something you have practiced 100 times before. Then he went back inside and shut the door behind him. I stood alone in that garage for a long, long time that night. I thought about calling Craig. I thought about calling Joan. But I told myself the same lie people tell themselves when they do not want to believe the truth. I told myself it was just a few days. I told myself my son loved me. I told myself this was all just a misunderstanding that would look funny to us later. That night I slept on the folding cot with my coat still on. The days that followed were hard in ways I am still finding words for. Christopher and Sherry had a daily routine, and I was not part of it. They ate breakfast together in the kitchen without calling me in. When I came inside in the mornings, Sherry would glance up from her phone and then right back down again without a word. Christopher would pour himself a cup of coffee and say something short like, "Sleep okay?" without even waiting for the answer. They fed me leftovers on a paper plate, sometimes cold, sometimes barely enough to fill a cup. They never asked how I was feeling. They never once asked about the stroke. They never mentioned the follow-up doctor's appointment I had missed because no one offered to take me. I asked Christopher 3 times to fix the cracked window in the garage. Once at the kitchen table, once in the hallway, once when I caught him alone on the back porch. Each time he told me he would get to it. He never did. My body was healing slowly, but the cold in that garage at night was fighting every bit of progress my body tried to make. My joints ached deep in the bone. Some mornings I could barely close my hand into a fist. I began keeping a mental record the way I had been trained to do in the courthouse over all those years. Dates, times, temperatures, words spoken, doors left closed. I held it all inside my mind, the way water holds its shape in a glass. Lynn called me on a Wednesday, 4 days after I had arrived. She could hear something in my voice that I was trying very hard to hide. She asked me if I was really okay. I told her I was fine, just a little tired. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Grandma Judy, I already mailed you something. It is a smartwatch. It tracks your health, but it also records audio if you press the small button on the side. I want you to wear it every single day." She said it plainly, like it was a small thing, but her voice had something careful tucked inside it, like she already sensed that something about this house was not right. The watch arrived 2 days later in a small padded envelope. I charged it quietly using the single outlet near the cot. I put it on my wrist and did not take it off again from that moment on. That Friday, the Pennsylvania temperature dropped sharply overnight. Inside the garage, I could see my own breath rising in small clouds. I pulled every piece of clothing I had packed over myself and lay flat on that cot, staring up at the bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Then the voices came again. Sherry first, low and deliberate. Then Christopher, answering her in a tone I had never heard from him before in all of his life. Not angry, not sad, not even guilty. Just practical, businesslike. Like two people going quietly over a shopping list instead of talking about his own mother lying in the cold, 30 feet away. I heard Sherry say they needed to be patient. I heard Christopher say they had plenty of time. Then Sherry said something about my house on Maple Grove Lane. She spoke about what it would take to get legal access to it. And then she said a word. A legal term I had filed more times than I could count. Across more than 3 decades in the Pennsylvania courthouse system. Guardianship. My whole body went cold in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with the temperature in that garage. I reached up with a slow and steady hand and pressed the small side button on the smartwatch Lynn had sent me. I felt the faint vibration against my wrist that told me it was recording. I did not move a single muscle. I did not breathe. That is not something people say to sound dramatic. I mean it exactly as I say it. For those few minutes while Sherry and Christopher talked on the other side of that wall, I lay completely still on that folding cot with my hand pressed flat against my wrist, and I did not draw a single breath deep enough to make a sound. I was 68 years old with a stroke still healing inside my body, lying in a freezing garage in the middle of the Pennsylvania night, and every single year I had ever spent inside a courthouse was alive inside me in that moment. I listened. I let the watch do what Lynn had built it to do, and I heard everything. Sherry was talking about timelines. She said that the cold alone might speed things up. She said the doctors had already noted some minor confusion after the stroke, and that if they were patient, the confusion would likely get worse on its own. She said all they needed was one documented episode, one moment where a neighbor or a doctor saw something they could point to later. She said once they had that, they could petition the court for emergency guardianship, and Judith would not be able to fight it. She used the word incompetent. She said it calmly and without flinching, the way you might say the word cloudy when describing the weather. Then Christopher spoke. He said the house on Maple Grove Lane was worth a great deal. He said the retirement savings account alone was enough to set them both up comfortably for years. He said all they had to do was wait. He said no one would question a devoted son trying to manage the affairs of a mother who had suffered a stroke. He said the paperwork would be easy. He said he already knew which attorney to call. Then they laughed together softly, like two people sharing a private joke over dinner, and I heard the sound of chairs scraping back and footsteps moving away from the kitchen toward the hallway. Then the lights inside clicked off and the house went quiet. I lay there in that dark, cold garage with my smartwatch still warm against my wrist, and I thought of every single elder guardianship case I had ever filed inside that courthouse. I thought of the faces of the people who came to us confused and frightened, people whose families had turned on them like a tide turning against a shore. I thought of how many of those cases had been stopped in time and how many had not. And then I pressed the stop button gently on the watch, felt the soft vibration confirm the file had saved, and I sat up on that cot very slowly and put both feet flat on the cold concrete floor. I was not confused. I was not fragile. I was furious. But I had spent 31 years learning that fury without a plan is just noise. So I sat there in the dark and I made my plan. The next morning, I waited until I heard both Christopher and Sherry leave the house. Christopher left first at 7:15 for work. Sherry left 30 minutes later. I heard both cars pull out of the driveway. I counted another 10 minutes just to be certain. Then I walked quietly from the garage into the kitchen, picked up the house phone from the counter, and I called Craig Barksdale. Craig answered on the second ring. I said, "Craig, it is Judith. I need you to listen to me, and I need you to not ask questions until I have finished talking." He said, "I am listening." So I told him everything. The garage, the cot, the cold window, the paper plates, the missed doctor's appointment, and then I told him about the recording. Craig was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Judith, do you still have the file on the watch?" I said yes. He said, "Do not delete it. Do not let anyone touch that watch. I am going to give you a number for my secure email, and I need you to transfer that file before anything else happens today. Craig had retired from the courthouse 2 years before me, but he had gone on to work part-time with a small elder law firm run by a man named Bradley Frank. Bradley Frank was one of the sharpest elder rights attorneys in the entire state of Pennsylvania, and Craig trusted him completely. I connected the smartwatch to my phone using the small cable Lynn had tucked into the envelope along with the device. Lynn had even written a little note in her careful handwriting explaining exactly how to transfer audio files. That child had thought of everything. I sent the file to Craig's secure address, and then I forwarded a second copy directly to Bradley Frank's firm. Then I called Joan Brock. Joan answered before the second ring was even finished. I told her where I was and what had been happening. She made a sound that was not quite a word, but carried more feeling than most sentences. She said, "Judith Elliott, you should have called me 5 days ago." I told her she was right. She told me she would be at the end of the driveway within the hour, and if I needed to leave that house at any point, I was to walk straight to her car, and she would take me without asking a single question. I told her I loved her. She said, "I know that. Now you listen to Bradley Frank, and you do exactly what he says." Bradley Frank called me that same afternoon while Christopher was still at work, and Sherry was running errands. His voice was calm and direct. He said the recording was clear enough to be used as evidence of elder abuse, financial coercion, and deliberate exposure to hazardous living conditions. He said the unheated garage alone violated Pennsylvania's elder care standards, and that, combined with the recorded conversation about guardianship, we had more than enough to move forward immediately. He said he had already contacted the county courthouse and was filing for an emergency restraining order and an immediate freeze on all assets tied to the Maple Grove Lane property. He said the freeze would prevent Christopher or Sherry from making any financial moves against my accounts or property while the legal process played out. He also said something I will never forget for as long as I live. He said, "Mrs. Elliott, in 30 years of practicing elder law, I have seen families do terrible things to the people who loved them most. What makes your case different is that you knew exactly what evidence you needed, and you had the clarity and the courage to get it yourself. A lot of people in your position would not have been able to do that." I thanked him. Then I went back to that garage, and I sat on that cot, and for the first time since the night I had arrived, I allowed myself to cry. Not from fear, not from sadness. From the deep and shaking relief of knowing that the truth had been captured and it could not be taken back. I barely slept that second night, not from cold, though the cold was still there, but because I was going over everything in my mind the way I used to review case files before a big hearing. I thought about Christopher as a little boy. I thought about the years I had worked double shifts to make sure he had everything he needed. I thought about how I had believed with my whole heart that raising a child with love meant that love would come back to you when you needed it most. I understand now that love is not a deposit you make in a bank and withdraw later. It is a living thing. It has to be chosen every single day. And Christopher had simply stopped choosing it. On the morning of the third day, I got up before sunrise. I washed my face with cold water from the garage utility sink. I put on my best blouse and the gray blazer I had packed at the bottom of my bag. I fixed my hair the way I always wore it for court. Then I picked up the folder of printed legal documents that Bradley Frank's assistant, a sharp young woman named Jody Baker, had driven out to Joan's house the evening before, and that Joan had quietly slipped to me through a crack in the side gate, while Christopher and Sherry watched television inside. I walked through the door from the garage into the kitchen. Christopher was standing at the counter with a coffee mug in his hand. Sherry was sitting at the table scrolling through her phone. They both looked up at me with the mild, empty expression they had worn every morning I had been in this house. Christopher said, "Morning, Mom. The way you say something you do not mean." I walked to the kitchen table and I set the folder down in front of him. He looked at it. Then he looked at me. I said, "That is an emergency restraining order, an asset freeze on all accounts and property associated with my name, and a formal complaint filed with the Pennsylvania Adult Protective Services Office citing elder abuse and unlawful housing conditions." My voice did not shake, not even once. Christopher's face went white. Sherry stood up from the table. She started to say something, but I held up one hand and she stopped. I said, "There is also a recorded audio file, already transferred to 2 separate secure legal servers, of a conversation that took place in this kitchen 2 nights ago. Bradley Frank of the Frank and Hutchinson Elder Law Group has reviewed it in full. His partner Shane Hutchinson has filed the emergency motions this morning." Christopher opened his mouth. He closed it again. His coffee mug was still in his hand, and I watched his grip tighten around it like a man trying to hold on to something that was already gone. Then we all heard it at the same time. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway, then another, then footsteps on the front porch and a firm, steady knock at the door. Christopher looked at me. I looked back at him steadily. I said, "That will be the officers." He did not move. So I walked to the front door and I opened it myself. 2 uniformed officers stood on the porch with legal documents in hand. The taller one introduced himself and asked if Christopher Valentine and Sherry Perkins were present at the residence. I said they were. He nodded and stepped inside. He handed the documents to Christopher directly and explained in plain and careful language that both he and Sherry Perkins were being served with a 30-day restraining order requiring them to immediately vacate the property at this address, which was legally owned solely by Judith Marie Elliott, and that any attempt to access financial accounts, property, or legal documents belonging to Judith Elliott during the period of the freeze would result in immediate criminal charges. Sherry grabbed Christopher's arm. Christopher looked at the papers in his hand and then looked at me, and I saw something move across his face that I had not seen there in a very long time. Not anger, not calculation. Something much smaller and much sadder than either of those things. He looked, for just a moment, like the 9-year-old boy who had cried at his father's graveside and reached up for my hand in the dark. But I had slept on a folding cot in a freezing garage for 3 nights, while my own son waited for the cold to make me useful to him, and I had run out of the kind of mercy that looks the other way. I stepped aside, and I let the law do what the law was built to do.